The morning of July 10, 1942, arrived on Akutan Island the way most mornings did, shrouded in impenetrable gray. Machinist mate Albert Knack pressed his face against the ice-cold window of the PBY Catalina, watching wisps of fog race across volcanic slopes that looked like the surface of another planet. Barren, hostile, empty. Lieutenant William Thies had been flying blind for over an hour, navigating by dead reckoning through weather so thick they couldn't see their own wingtips. They were supposed to be patrolling near Dutch Harbor, but somewhere in the soup they'd lost their bearings completely. When Knack finally spotted the Shumagan Islands through a break in the clouds, both men felt the tension in their shoulders release slightly. At least now they knew where they were. Thies banked the lumbering Catalina toward Akutan, cutting across the island to take the most direct route back to base. That's when Knack saw something that made his breath catch, a dark shape in a grassy valley half a mile inland from the coast. An airplane, upside down, tail pointing at the sky like an accusing finger. Even from altitude, the red circles were unmistakable. Japanese markings, a Zero fighter, intact. The aircraft that had been slaughtering American pilots at a ratio of 12-1 for the past 6 months. The plane that pilots described with a mixture of terror and awe. The fighter that seemed to defy physics itself, just sitting there, waiting. Thies circled twice, banking steeply to give Knack a better view. The Zero looked almost pristine, no visible fire damage, no major structural failure. Just inverted in the marsh grass like some enormous insect that had rolled onto its back and couldn't right itself. They marked the position carefully on their chart and turned for Dutch Harbor, both men understanding they'd stumbled onto something significant, but not quite grasping the magnitude. What neither of them knew, what nobody could have known in that moment, was that they'd just found the single most valuable piece of intelligence in the entire Pacific War. An airplane that would expose every secret the Japanese had used to dominate the skies since Pearl Harbor. A machine that would fundamentally alter the tactical balance of the air war and save thousands of American lives. But getting that airplane off Akutan Island and into American hands would require 3 separate recovery attempts, 2 months of backbreaking work, and a level of operational secrecy that would determine who lived and who died in dogfights for the next 2 years. The clock was ticking. Every day that Zero sat on Akutan was another day Japanese commanders might discover it was missing and send a recovery team of their own. To understand why finding an intact Zero was like discovering the enemy's battle plans carved in stone, you need to understand what American pilots were facing in the first 6 months of the Pacific War. It wasn't just defeat. It was psychological devastation. December 8, 1941. The Japanese struck the Philippines with overwhelming force. By the end of the first week, 37 American pilots were dead, not from accidents or training failures, but shot out of the sky by an enemy they could barely comprehend. The Zeros came out of nowhere, faster than anything the Americans had encountered. More maneuverable than seemed physically possible for a machine of metal and rivets. They could climb at 5,000 feet per minute, a rate that left American fighters wallowing behind like swimmers trying to chase speedboats. They could turn inside any maneuver an American pilot attempted, rotating on what felt like a dime, always ending up behind you, no matter which way you turned. Their range was extraordinary, over 1,500 miles, which meant they could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory than American intelligence thought possible. And they were flown by pilots who'd been training for war since 1937, combat veterans from China, where they'd shot down 99 Chinese aircraft while losing only 2 Zeros to ground fire. American intelligence had heard rumors. Reports from China mentioned a fighter with extraordinary performance. But most commanders dismissed them as exaggerated, probably Chinese pilots making excuses for their losses. Japanese aircraft were supposed to be inferior copies of Western designs. Cheap, poorly made, flown by pilots who wore thick glasses because all Asians had bad eyesight, or so the racist training materials claimed. The training manuals weren't just wrong. They were catastrophically, lethally wrong. When 78 Zeros participated in the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, American fighters that managed to get airborne were simply outclassed. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk couldn't climb with a Zero. The Brewster F-2A Buffalo, already obsolete, couldn't turn with it. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was tougher and had heavier armament, but it was slower and far less agile. Pilots who tried to dogfight the Zero died. It was that simple. Captain Jesus Villamor, flying an obsolete P-26 P-shooter in the Philippines, watched Zeros tear through his formation like wolves through sheep. He survived only by diving away at full throttle, using his aircraft's superior dive speed to escape. Lieutenant Randall Keeter scored the first confirmed American kill against a Zero on December 8th, but his squadron lost 11 aircraft that same day. At Clark Field, 18 P-40s sat parked on the runway when Japanese bombers arrived. All 18 were destroyed on the ground. The pilots never even got airborne. By January 1942, the official American tactic against the Zero was both simple and humiliating. If you encounter a Zero, run away. Dive for the deck. Use your heavier aircraft's better dive speed and get out of the fight. Don't try to turn with it. Don't try to climb with it. Just run. And even that didn't always work. Over Java in February 1942, Allied pilots flying. Hurricanes and P-40s faced Zeros in battle after battle. The kill ratio was devastating. For every Zero shot down, the Allies lost 10 aircraft. Squadron leader Mervyn Hiscock of the Royal Australian Air Force watched his unit destroyed in just 3 days of combat. On February 19th, his squadron had 16 Hurricanes. By February 22nd, they had 3 flyable aircraft left. The rest were burning wreckage scattered across Java's airfields. At Darwin, Australia, on February 19, 1942, a single Japanese raid destroyed 23 Allied aircraft. The Zero seemed not just superior, it seemed invincible. Pilots returning from combat described it with almost mystical reverence. It could turn on a dime. It could climb like a rocket. It could stay airborne for hours while American fighters were forced to return to base for fuel. Some pilots claimed the Zero had no weaknesses at all, that Japanese engineers had somehow achieved aerodynamic perfection. Morale cratered. Pilots requested transfers to other theaters. Some developed mysterious medical conditions that grounded them. Nobody wanted to face the Zero again, but one man refused to accept that the Zero was unbeatable. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch was the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, based out of San Diego in early 1942. He'd been a naval aviator since 1930, serving as both a test pilot and gunnery instructor. But what set Thatch apart wasn't his flying skill, it was his mind. Thatch spent his evenings working through combat scenarios using matchsticks on his kitchen table to represent aircraft formations. His wife would find him at 2 a.m, dozens of matches arranged in complex patterns, lost in concentration as he worked through tactical problems. In spring 1941, Thatch received an intelligence bulletin describing the Zero. The report came from the Fleet Air Tactical Unit, published September 22, 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America was even at war. It detailed everything the Japanese fighter could do: extraordinary maneuverability, 5,000 foot per minute climb rate, incredibly tight turning radius. The Wildcat Thatch was flying couldn't match any of it. Most commanders filed the report away. Thatch did something different. He spent every evening for weeks trying to figure out a tactical solution, moving matches around his kitchen table until his eyes burned with fatigue. The standard American fighter formation was 3 aircraft, a leader, and 2 wingmen. It had been used since World War I and was considered doctrine, unchangeable as scripture. But Thatch realized that formation had a fatal flaw. It required pilots to spend too much attention watching their leader and not enough watching for threats. A Zero could exploit those moments of distraction. He redesigned everything from scratch. Thatch switched to a two-plane element, a leader and wingman flying side by side, separated by about the turning radius of a Wildcat. Two of these elements made a four-plane division. When one element got jumped by a Zero, both elements would turn toward each other. The geometry was elegant. The Zero pilot would line up a shot on one element, then suddenly find himself facing two Wildcats coming straight at him from the opposite direction. If he pressed his attack, he'd fly into a head-on engagement, a suicide play against the Wildcat's heavy armament. If he broke off, the other element would slide onto his tail. Thatch called it the beam defense position. His pilots had a more colorful name that can't be printed in polite company, but they practiced it religiously. In May 1942, Thatch arranged for faster aircraft to play the role of attacking Zeros in training exercises. The beam defense worked in every single practice engagement. The attackers couldn't get a clean shot. The defending Wildcats always ended up in firing position, but Thatch had never tested it against real Zeros. He'd get that chance at Midway. Before Midway, there was another battle that revealed just how desperate the situation had become. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 was the first carrier battle in history, and it exposed American tactical deficiencies in brutal clarity. Fighting Squadron 42, flying Wildcats off the USS Yorktown, engaged Zeros covering Japanese bombers. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley led the squadron with distinction, but even he couldn't overcome the performance gap. American pilots shot down several Zeros, but lost twice as many Wildcats. Lieutenant J.G. William Leonard described his combat that day. I got one good burst into a Zero, saw pieces fly off, then he just turned inside my turn radius, and I had to dive away. It was like fighting a hummingbird while riding a boulder. The tactical lesson was clear. American pilots needed either better aircraft or better tactics, preferably both. But new aircraft would take years to design and build. Better tactics could be developed immediately if someone could figure out how to neutralize the Zero's advantages. June 4th, 1942. The morning was clear over the Pacific, 200 miles northeast of Midway Island. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers on an attack run against the Japanese carrier fleet. Massey commanded Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3. Thatch and 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 flew escort at 1,500 feet above the torpedo bombers. Their mission was straightforward: protect Massey's flight from Japanese fighters long enough for the Devastators to release their torpedoes and cripple the enemy carriers. What happened instead became one of the most lopsided massacres in naval aviation history, and one of the most important tactical validations. When the torpedo bombers started their attack run shortly after 0800 hours, 20 Zeros dove out of the sun and tore into the formation like sharks into a school of fish. Thatch's division of 4 aircraft, himself, his wingman Ensign Robert Dibb, Lieutenant Brainerd McCumber, and Ensign Edgar Bassett, tried to engage. Bassett's Wildcat was hit almost immediately. A Zero pilot put a precise burst into Bassett's fuselage. The Wildcat shuddered, slanted toward the water-trailing smoke, and exploded in a ball of orange flame. Bassett never had a chance to bail out. Thatch called for Dibb and McCumber to follow him into the beam defense. They turned toward each other. A Zero lined up on McCumber, closing fast. The Japanese pilot was confident, aggressive. He'd probably shot down dozens of Allied aircraft and saw this as just another kill. Thatch turned hard toward McCumber. Dibb followed Thatch's turn. The Zero pilot saw Thatch coming head-on, but committed to his attack anyway, perhaps thinking he could get his shot off before the American could respond. Fatal mistake. Thatch squeezed the trigger. His 4 50 caliber machine guns and single 30mm cannon hammered out a 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage like a deadly staircase. Pieces flew off. The Zero's engine erupted in flames and the aircraft fell away trailing black smoke. First kill using the beam defense in actual combat. But there were 19 more Zeros and only 3 Wildcats left. Dib called out that he had a Zero on his tail. Thatch turned toward him. Dib turned toward Thatch. They crossed paths, weaving like dancers in a deadly ballet. The Zero pilot tried to follow Dib through the turn and flew right into Thatch's firing cone. Thatch hit him with a head-on burst. The Zero shed part of its engine cowling and burst into flames. Second kill. They kept weaving back and forth. Every 20 to 30 seconds, another Zero would attack. Every 20 to 30 seconds, the weave would position one of the Wildcats for a deflection shot. McCumber's radio was out. He couldn't hear Thatch's instructions, but he stayed in formation and followed the turns instinctively. The 3 Wildcats survived 17 minutes of continuous combat against 20 Zeros. Thatch shot down 3 confirmed kills. Dib got 1. They lost 1 Wildcat. But Massey and all 12 Devastators were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Massey died in the attack. His wingman died. Every pilot in the squadron died. The beam defense worked. It kept Thatch's pilots alive when they should have been annihilated. But it wasn't enough to save the torpedo bombers. American pilots were surviving, not winning. What they needed wasn't just better tactics. They needed to know the Zero's weaknesses. They needed to understand how it performed at high speeds, how it rolled, how it handled under negative G forces. They needed test data, actual flight characteristics from an intact Zero. And while Thatch was fighting for his life over Midway, that Zero was about to crash on Akutan Island, 2,500 miles to the north. His name was Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. He was 19 years old, born September 10, 1922, in rural Japan. The son of a carpenter. Small for a pilot, barely 5 feet tall, but he'd passed flight training and earned his place in the cockpit. He'd been assigned to the carrier Ryujo, flying Zero serial number 4593, an aircraft that had left the Mitsubishi Nagoya factory on February 19, 1942, only 3.5 months old, nearly brand new. On June 4th, the same day Thatch was fighting at Midway, Koga launched from the Ryujo as part of a 3-plane section. His section leader was Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo. His other wingman was Petty Officer Suguo Shikata. Their target, Dutch Harbor, a naval base on Unalaska Island in the Aleutians. The attack was part of a diversionary operation during the Battle of Midway. Japanese commanders hoped to draw American naval forces north while their main carrier strike force hit Midway from the west. It was a strategic feint, and Koga's section was part of the deception. They would strike Dutch Harbor hard enough to make the Americans think a major invasion was coming through the Aleutians, pulling carriers and fighters away from the real target. Koga's section attacked Dutch Harbor shortly after 800 hours, strafing and bombing American installations. The base was lightly defended, but the Americans fought back with everything they had. Members of the 206th Coast Artillery Regiment fired 50 caliber machine guns at the attacking Zeros. Sailors on ships in the harbor added their own fire. Small arms rounds filled the air. Most missed. Hitting a fighter moving at 250 miles per hour with iron sights is nearly impossible. But some didn't miss. During one of his passes, Koga's Zero took several hits. Small arms fire, probably 50 caliber rounds. One bullet severed his main oil line, the line that ran from the oil cooler back to the engine. Without it, his engine would lose all its oil within minutes. Koga saw the oil pressure gauge dropping. He could see oil streaming behind his aircraft, leaving a dark trail against the gray Aleutian sky. His engine temperature was rising. Within 5 minutes, maybe less, the engine would seize and the aircraft would fall. He radioed his section leader and headed southwest toward Akutan Island. The Japanese had designated Akutan as an emergency landing site. A submarine was stationed offshore to pick up downed pilots. The island had what looked like a long, flat, grassy valley half a mile inland from the coast. From altitude, it looked perfect. A long stretch of green, smooth, solid, or so it appeared. Koga circled the valley once. His engine was running rough now, temperature climbing, oil pressure nearly zero. He had maybe 2 minutes before the engine quit completely. Shikata, his wingman, circled with him. On the second pass, Shikata noticed something odd about the grass. There was a shine to it, water reflecting sunlight. He suddenly realized what he was seeing. It wasn't solid ground, it was a bog, marsh hidden beneath knee-high grass. Shikata frantically tried to signal Koga, "Make a belly landing. Keep the gear up." But Koga's engine was failing. He already had his landing gear down, his flaps down. He was committed to a wheels-down landing. There was no time to reconfigure, no altitude to spare for another pass. Koga's wheels touched the grass shortly after the attack on Dutch Harbor ended. They sank immediately into the mud. The Zero's momentum carried it forward. The wheels dug deeper. The tail came up. The aircraft flipped violently, throwing up a cloud of water and mud and grass. It came to rest upside down, tail pointing skyward, engine buried in the bog. Koga was still strapped in the cockpit, hanging upside down from his harness. The impact had broken his neck. He died instantly. The shock of deceleration when the wheels caught in the mud had snapped his head forward with lethal force. Koga's wingmen circled overhead. Endo and Shikata watched the crash. They saw the Zero flip. They saw it come to rest inverted. They couldn't see Koga. They didn't know if he was alive or dead. Japanese pilots had standing orders to destroy any Zero that crashed in enemy territory. The orders were explicit and unambiguous. Strafe the wreckage. Burn it. Make it unusable. Don't let the Americans capture an intact Zero. The orders existed for good reason. The Americans had been trying to get their hands on a flyable Zero since the war began. Every crashed Zero had been studied, but all had been too damaged to reveal their secrets. This one looked almost perfect, just upside down. If Koga was alive, strafing the airplane would kill him. Endo and Shikata couldn't see any movement. No sign of life, but they couldn't be certain. They circled for several minutes, waiting, hoping to see Koga climb out. Nothing. The submarine was waiting offshore. They had to leave before American aircraft arrived. Japanese fighters were low on fuel. The attack was over. They had to return to the Ryujo. Endo and Shikata made a decision that would haunt them and change history. They left the Zero intact and flew back to their carrier. They'd failed to follow their orders. They knew the consequences. They knew an intact Zero in American hands would be catastrophic for Japan's war effort, but they couldn't bring themselves to kill their friend. That moment of compassion, that fundamentally human decision, would cost Japan the air superiority it had maintained since December 1941. The crash site remained undisturbed for 36 days. Akutan Island is one of the most remote places on Earth. Barren, volcanic, almost always covered in fog. The Aleutian Islands have some of the worst weather in the world. Rain, fog, wind that can knock you flat, and cold that seeps into your bones. The valley where Koga crashed was out of sight of standard flight paths. Ships passing the island couldn't see inland. The terrain blocked the view. The Zero sat there through June, through the first week of July, slowly sinking deeper into the bog. Rain fell. Fog rolled through. The Zero settled into the mud, but remained largely intact. The inverted position actually helped preserve it. The engine and cockpit were protected from the elements. The canopy, pressed into the marsh grass, created a seal that kept water from flooding the interior. Japanese commanders didn't know the Zero was there. Endo and Shikata had reported Koga's aircraft as destroyed in emergency landing. Technically true, but lacking the crucial detail that it was intact and recoverable. American forces didn't know either. The attack on Dutch Harbor had been chaotic. Multiple aircraft had been engaged. Nobody had time to conduct a search of every remote valley on every island in the chain. The Zero could have sat there forever, slowly consumed by the bog, its secrets dying with it. Then Lieutenant William Thies got lost in the fog. July 11th, 1942. Lieutenant Robert Kermsey led a recovery team to the crash site. They landed on the coast in a smaller float plane and hiked half a mile inland through terrain that tried to break their ankles with every step. When they reached the crash site, they found Koga's body still in the cockpit, hanging upside down from his harness. They pulled him out carefully. His neck was clearly broken. The angle was all wrong. They dug a grave on a nearby knoll overlooking the valley. They had no chaplain, but they gave Koga as proper a burial, as circumstances allowed. They marked the grave with stones. Then they examined the Zero. Kermsey walked around the aircraft slowly, taking notes. The airframe was intact. The wings showed no major damage. The tail was straight. The fuselage had a few bullet holes from the Dutch harbor attack. You could push your finger through them, but nothing catastrophic. The engine appeared undamaged. The three-blade Sumitomo propeller was bent from the impact, but repairable. The landing gear was sheared off when the wheels caught in the bog. The vertical stabilizer was bent. The rudder was twisted. The wingtips were scraped. The flaps were damaged. The canopy was cracked. But overall, the aircraft was in remarkable condition. This Zero could fly again. Kermsey reported back to Dutch Harbor immediately. The Navy moved fast. They understood what they had. But nature fought back. The first recovery attempt failed when the ship carrying lifting equipment lost 2 anchors trying to hold position in brutal Aleutian currents. Tides in the Aleutians can change 15 feet in 6 hours. Winds regularly exceed 50 mph. The recovery team couldn't move the Zero. It weighed over 5,000 pounds and was stuck deep in the mud. The bog held it like a vice. They had to leave it and try again. On July 15th, a third recovery team arrived with better equipment, a portable crane, cables, and a barge. They worked for 2 days in miserable conditions, cold rain, fog so thick they could barely see 20 feet. The mud was like glue. They rigged cables under the Zero's fuselage. The crane strained. The cables went taut. Slowly, the Zero began to move. Mud sucked at the airframe. There was a wet, tearing sound as the aircraft pulled free. They hauled it upright. Water and mud poured out of the cockpit and engine cowling. They let it drain, then began the arduous task of moving it overland to the coast. They had to build a temporary road through the marsh, laying down wooden planks. They dragged the Zero inch by inch. It took another full day to reach the barge. At Dutch Harbor, they turned the Zero right side up and cleaned off the worst of the mud. The aircraft was filthy but salvageable. They loaded it into the cargo hold of the USS St. Mihiel, a transport ship. The Zero was wrapped and secured. Armed guards stood watch. Nobody could know what was in the hold. The St. Mihiel sailed for Seattle on July 20th. The voyage took 12 days through rough North Pacific seas. The ship arrived in Seattle on August 1st. From there, the Zero went by barge to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. When the Zero arrived at North Island on August 12th, the Navy erected a 12-foot high stockade around it inside a hangar. Armed Marines stood guard 24 hours a day. Nobody was allowed near the aircraft without written authorization from the base commander. The threat of souvenir hunters was real. One stolen part could compromise the entire intelligence operation. The best mechanics worked in total secrecy for 6 weeks, documenting every part, measuring every dimension, photographing everything. They straightened the vertical stabilizer, repaired the rudder, replaced the wingtips, fixed the flaps, manufactured new landing struts. They patched the bullet holes from Dutch Harbor and repainted the red Hinomaru roundels with American insignia, blue circles with white stars. On September 20th, 1942, 2 months and 16 days after Koga crashed on Akutan, the Zero was ready to fly. Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders would be the test pilot. Sanders was 31 years old, a Navy test pilot since 1938. He was known for precision and technical analysis. Not flashy, not an ace, just a methodical pilot who understood aircraft systems and could articulate what he felt in the controls. The Navy needed someone who could fly the Zero and extract every bit of technical data from it. Sanders was the right man for the job. On September 20th, at 0900 hours, Sanders climbed into the Zero's cockpit for the first time. The cockpit was cramped, much smaller than a Wildcat. Sanders wasn't a large man, but even he felt squeezed. The seat was hard, the cushioning minimal. Japanese pilots were selected partly for their small stature. A pilot over 5'8" would struggle to fit. The instrument panel was simpler than American aircraft. All the labels were in Japanese. Sanders had studied translations, but it still felt alien. He found the throttle, the mixture control, the propeller pitch lever, the landing gear handle, the flap control. Everything was where it should be, just laid out differently. Sanders started the Nakajima Sakai engine. It coughed once, caught, and settled into a smooth idle. The sound was different than an American engine, higher pitched. The whole airframe felt delicate. He advanced the throttle slightly. The engine responded immediately. Crisp, no hesitation, Sanders released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. The Zero rolled easily. The tail wheel steering was light and responsive, almost too light. He lined up on the runway and advanced the throttle smoothly. The Zero accelerated quickly, very quickly. At 60 knots, Sanders pulled back on the stick. The Zero leaped into the air. The takeoff roll was remarkably short, maybe half what a Wildcat needed. Sanders retracted the landing gear and raised the flaps. The Zero climbed steeply. Climb rate was immediately apparent. The Zero was climbing at over 4,000 feet per minute. It was extraordinary. Sanders leveled off at 5,000 feet and began testing basic handling. At low speeds, the Zero was magnificent, responsive, precise, alive in his hands. Then he pushed the airspeed up. At 150 knots, the controls still felt normal. At 180 knots, he felt the ailerons stiffen slightly. At 200 knots, 230 mph, the ailerons froze. Sanders tried to roll the aircraft. He pushed the stick hard to the right. The ailerons barely moved. It felt like the control surfaces were locked. He had to use both hands and significant force just to get a slow roll started. The fabric-covered control surfaces were ballooning with air pressure at high speeds, becoming rigid and immovable. At 250 knots, it was physically impossible to roll the Zero at any useful rate. A pilot could push with all his strength and get maybe a few degrees of bank per second. In combat, that was nothing. An American pilot in a Wildcat could roll hard at high speed, and the Zero couldn't follow. Sanders made careful notes. This was critical. Everything changed above 200 knots. Then he tested negative G maneuvers. He climbed to 10,000 feet, pushed the nose down into a dive, building speed. At 250 knots, he pulled back hard on the stick, then pushed forward abruptly. 0G, then -1G, then -2G. The engine coughed, sputtered, nearly quit. Sanders felt the power drop away. The propeller kept windmilling, but the engine was producing almost no thrust. He pushed the nose down, bringing positive G's back. The engine caught again. Power returned. The Zero's engine used a float-type carburetor. Under negative acceleration, the float valve couldn't maintain fuel pressure. The carburetor starved. The engine quit. If an American pilot pushed his aircraft into a dive with negative G's, the Zero following him would lose power and fall behind. That single weakness could save countless lives. Sanders flew 24 test flights between September 20th and October 15th. Each flight revealed more data. He tested the Zero against a Wildcat in mock combat. At low speeds, the Zero dominated completely. But when the Wildcat used speed, diving attacks, and high-speed reversals, the Zero couldn't follow. He tested armament. The Zero had two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and two 20mm cannons in the wings. The machine guns were inadequate against armored American aircraft. The cannons were effective, but had limited ammunition, only 60 rounds per gun. A few seconds of firing, and they were empty. He tested visibility. The canopy provided excellent visibility in most directions, but there was a large blind spot behind and below. An American pilot diving from above and behind could stay in that blind spot until the last second. He tested durability. The Zero's construction was extremely light. The aluminum skin was thinner than American standards. There was no armor around the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A few .50 caliber rounds in the right place could cause catastrophic damage. The Zero was designed for performance, not survivability. It was a knife fighter, deadly if it got close, but fragile. Sanders documented everything in his official report. He provided specific recommendations. Avoid turning fights at low speeds. Use diving attacks from altitude, building speed past 250 knots. Make a single firing pass, then zoom back to altitude. Use negative G dives to escape. If a Zero gets on your tail, roll hard right. The Zero rolls left more easily than right. Above 200 knots, roll hard before the Zero pilot can get his sights lined up. Sanders's report was classified top secret and distributed to fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific Fleet. But reading a report was one thing. Seeing it was another. The Navy decided to conduct live demonstrations. Lieutenant Melvin C. Boggy Hoffman was assigned to fly the Zero in mock combat against newly trained pilots. The demonstrations were held over San Diego Bay throughout late 1942 and into 1943. Each engagement was designed to test specific tactics. In the first demonstration, Hoffman showed low-speed turning fights. He flew the Zero against 4 Wildcat pilots who just completed training. The Wildcats tried every maneuver they knew. Hoffman stayed on their tails through every turn. One by one, the Wildcats would have been shot down. The student pilots learned viscerally. Don't dogfight a Zero at low speeds. You'll lose every time. In the second demonstration, Hoffman showed high-speed diving attacks. The Wildcat pilot started at 10,000 feet, Hoffman in the Zero at 5,000 feet. The Wildcats rolled, inverted, and dove, building speed past 250 knots. Hoffman tried to follow. Students watching from the ground saw him struggling with the controls. The Zero's roll was painfully slow. By the time Hoffman rolled in, the Wildcats were already climbing away. The lesson: hit the Zero fast. Don't slow down. Use speed as your weapon. In the third demonstration, a Wildcat pilot let Hoffman get on his tail. Hoffman closed to firing range. From the ground, it looked like the Wildcat was finished. Then the Wildcat pilot pushed over hard into a dive, unloading the wings. -2 Gs, Hoffman tried to follow. The Zero's engine coughed, sputtered, and quit. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Hoffman fell behind. The Wildcat extended range and climbed away. Students watched the smoke trail. They understood. If a Zero gets on your tail, push over hard. Use negative Gs. The Zero can't follow. The demonstrations continued for months. Hundreds of pilots rotated through the training program. Each one flew against Hoffman in the captured Zero. Each one saw the weaknesses demonstrated in actual flight. Each one learned the tactics that would keep them alive. By early 1943, word had spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. The Zero had weaknesses. Specific, exploitable weaknesses. The tactics worked. Marine Corps Pilot Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh went through the training in early 1943. Walsh would go on to shoot down 21 Japanese aircraft during the war. Years later, he credited the Akutan Zero training with saving his life multiple times. Knowing what to do when a Zero was on your tail, information that came from Koga's Zero saved my life several times, he said in a 1987 interview. Before that training, we were just trying to survive. After that training, we were hunting them. But Walsh was just one pilot among thousands who benefited from the captured Zero secrets. The real impact became visible in the statistics. In August 1942, American forces invaded Guadalcanal, beginning a brutal 6-month campaign. Marine Fighter Squadron 223, VMF 223, arrived on August 20th with 19 Wildcats and immediately began engaging Zeros daily. The squadron's commander, Major John L. Smith, had received preliminary intelligence from the Akutan Zero tests. He drilled his pilots on the new tactics: maintain speed, attack from altitude, never turn with a Zero at low speeds. On August 21st, Smith led his squadron against a formation of 18 Zeros escorting Japanese bombers. Using high-speed diving attacks, VMF 223 shot down 16 Japanese aircraft while losing only 3 Wildcats, not to Zeros in dogfights, but to defensive fire from bombers. It was a revelation. For the first time, American pilots were winning decisively against Zeros. Captain Marion Carl, Smith's executive officer, shot down his first Zero on August 24th using a high-speed diving pass. "I came in at 300 knots, put a 2-second burst into him, and climbed away before his wingman could react," Carl later wrote. 3 months earlier, I would have tried to turn with them and probably died. The intelligence from that captured Zero changed everything. Carl would end the war with 18 kills, most of them Zeros. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In July 1942, before the Akutan Zero was tested, the kill ratio stood at 12 Japanese kills for every 1 American loss. Japanese pilots were dominant, and American morale was in free fall. By March 1943, 4 months after the training demonstrations began, the ratio was nearly even. American pilots were no longer being slaughtered. They were fighting the Zero on equal terms. By June 1943, American pilots were killing more Zeros than they were losing. The ratio had reversed. The change wasn't primarily because of better aircraft, although new planes were arriving. The Wildcat was still the primary fighter in many squadrons through mid-1943. The change was because of knowledge. American pilots understood how the Zero performed. They knew when it was dangerous and when it was vulnerable. They could predict what a Zero pilot would do and counter it effectively. What the Japanese didn't understand was why their tactics were failing. Zero pilots had been using the same combat techniques since 1937. They'd worked perfectly in China, at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, in Burma, over the Coral Sea. Suddenly, in early 1943, those techniques stopped working. American pilots were avoiding turning fights. They were attacking from altitude with high-speed dives. They were rolling away at speeds where the Zero couldn't follow. Japanese pilots tried to adapt. They attempted tighter turns, hoping to force Americans into slow-speed engagements. But American pilots refused to turn. They'd attack, then extend range using speed and altitude. No matter what bait the Japanese offered, the Americans wouldn't take it. Japanese pilots tried aggressive pursuit, closing range before Americans could dive away. But American pilots used -G dives that somehow caused pursuing Zero's engines to cut out. Japanese pilots couldn't understand why. They knew to avoid -G maneuvers generally, but they didn't have specific data about fuel pressure loss. They didn't understand the carburetor mechanism. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was they were fighting an enemy who understood their aircraft better than they did. American pilots knew the exact speed where the Zero's ailerons would lock up, 200 knots. They knew the roll rate degraded asymmetrically, easier left, harder right. They knew about the carburetor issue under -Gs. They'd seen it demonstrated. They'd practiced against it. Japanese pilots had general knowledge. They knew the Zero handled poorly at high speed, but they didn't have numbers. They didn't have a performance envelope chart showing exactly where the weaknesses appeared. American pilots did. That knowledge gap was created by one intact Zero sitting in a hangar in San Diego, and it was killing Japanese pilots every single day. Japanese intelligence officers examined wreckage from downed American fighters, documented improvements in American aircraft technology. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in early 1943, faster than the Zero, more heavily armed, able to take tremendous damage. The Vought F-4U Corsair was even faster, with better high-altitude performance. Japanese analysts concluded that American aircraft technology had surpassed the Zero. Better planes were beating their fighters. That was partly true. The new American aircraft were superior. But the real advantage wasn't just the aircraft, it was the tactics. Pilots flying the older Wildcats were also killing Zeros at improved rates. The tactics worked regardless of aircraft type. The knowledge worked against all Zeros. On January 12, 1944, First Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen, a Marine Corps pilot flying an F-4U Corsair from Vella La Vella, shot down 5 Zeros in a single mission. He used the high-speed attack tactics developed from the Akutan Zero data. Dive from altitude, build speed past 250 knots, make a single firing pass, zoom back to altitude, never turn, never slow down, never give the Zero a chance to use its superior low-speed maneuverability. Over the next 17 days, Hansen shot down 15 more Zeros using the same tactics, 20 kills in 17 days. The Zero had gone from the most feared fighter in the Pacific to target practice for pilots who knew its weaknesses. By mid-1944, Japanese losses to American fighters were catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19-20, 1944, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, resulted in the loss of approximately 650 Japanese aircraft against 123 American aircraft. Most Japanese losses were Zeros and other carrier aircraft. The battle took place near Guam. American fighter pilots flying F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs slaughtered Japanese formations using tactics that exploited every weakness the Akutan Zero had revealed. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighter Squadron 15 off the USS Essex, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement on June 19th. 7 of them Zeros. They were still trying to turn with us at low speeds, McCampbell said in his after-action report. We just used speed and altitude advantage. It was almost too easy. Experienced Zero pilots who'd survived the early war were being killed by American pilots with only a few months of combat experience. The Americans weren't better pilots inherently. They just had better information. What Endo and Shikata never knew Makoto Endo and Suguo Shikata, the 2 pilots who'd circled over Koga's crashed Zero and made the fateful decision not to destroy it, survived the war. Endo continued flying Zeros throughout 1942 and 1943, participating in battles over the Solomon Islands. He was shot down near Rabaul in March 1944 by a Corsair pilot using high-speed diving tactics. Endo bailed out and was rescued by a Japanese submarine. He survived the war and returned to Japan, where he worked as a commercial pilot until his retirement in 1970. Shikata was transferred to carrier duty in late 1943 and flew in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His Zero was shot down on June 19, 1944, during the Turkey Shoot. He ditched in the ocean and was never recovered. He was 23 years old. Neither man ever knew what happened to Koga's Zero. They never knew it had been recovered by Americans. They never knew it had been tested, analyzed, and used to train thousands of pilots. They never knew their moment of compassion, their inability to strafe their friends' aircraft, had changed the course of the Pacific Air War. The secret remained classified until after the war ended. The Akutan Zero remained at North Island through 1943, flying regular demonstration missions. In late 1943, it was flown to Washington National Airport and displayed as a war trophy. Crowds lined up to see it. The aircraft that had terrorized Allied forces for 2 years was now sitting in an American hangar with United States Navy insignia painted on the fuselage. Newspaper photographers took pictures. The Zero became a symbol of American technological espionage and tactical adaptation. In 1944, the Zero was recalled to North Island for continued use as a training aircraft. Newly commissioned pilots flew mock combat against it before deploying to the Pacific. The lessons were always the same. Don't turn with it. Attack with speed. Exploit its weaknesses. On February 15, 1945, the Akutan Zero was destroyed in a training accident. The Zero was taxiing for takeoff at North Island when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber lost control during landing. The Helldiver's landing gear collapsed. The aircraft skidded across the tarmac and slammed into the Zero. The Helldiver's propeller, still spinning at high speed, sliced through the Zero's fuselage like a saw. The Zero was cut nearly in half. Fuel spilled across the tarmac. Both aircraft were written off as total losses. The pilot of the Helldiver survived with minor injuries. Nobody was in the Zero at the time. The most valuable intelligence asset of the Pacific War was gone. But by then, it didn't matter. The Akutan Zero had already served its purpose. It had revealed the Zero's secrets. It had trained thousands of pilots. It had changed the air war in the Pacific. The knowledge it provided would never be lost. William Thies, the PBY pilot who spotted the Zero on July 10, 1942, survived the war. He continued flying patrol missions throughout the Aleutian Campaign and later in the Central Pacific. He flew submarine patrols, search and rescue missions, and anti-shipping strikes. He retired from the Navy in 1946 with the rank of lieutenant commander. He never received official recognition for finding the Zero. His name appears in operational reports, but he was never decorated for the discovery. Thies died in 1989 at age 73. His obituary mentioned his service as a patrol pilot, but made no mention of the most important discovery of his career. Albert Knack, the machinist mate who first saw the Zero from the window of Thies's PBY, went on to serve in the Pacific through the end of the war. He participated in numerous patrol and rescue operations. After the war, he returned to his home state of Michigan and worked as an automotive mechanic. He rarely talked about spotting the Zero. To him, it was just another patrol flight. He'd seen plenty of crashed aircraft. He had no idea this one would change history. Knack died in 1994 at age 78. Robert Kermsey, who led the first recovery team and gave Koga a burial on Akutan, continued serving in the Pacific. He participated in amphibious operations in the Gilbert Islands and the Marianas. He was promoted to lieutenant commander and served as a salvage operations officer. After the war, he worked in commercial shipping. Kermsey never knew the full impact of the Zero he'd helped recover. To him, it was just one of many salvage operations he'd conducted during the war. He died in 2001 at age 86. Eddie R. Sanders, the test pilot who flew the Akutan Zero on its first American flight, continued his distinguished career. He flew combat missions in the Pacific, testing new aircraft and training pilots. After the war, he stayed in the Navy and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. He served in anti-submarine warfare development during the Cold War, working on tactics and technology to counter Soviet submarines. Sanders rarely discussed the Akutan Zero publicly. The test flights remained classified for years. When historians finally interviewed him in the 1980s, Sanders described the Zero as a remarkable aircraft at low speeds, but with obvious limitations at high speeds. American pilots could exploit those limitations easily once they understood what they were, he said. Sanders died in 1998 at age 87. Melvin C. Boogie Hoffman, who conducted the dogfighting demonstrations, also became a Rear Admiral. He trained hundreds of pilots in anti-Zero tactics throughout the war. After the war, he served in various command positions and helped develop jet fighter tactics during the transition from propeller to jet aircraft. Hoffman credited the captured Zero with being one of the most valuable training tools the Navy had during the Pacific War. Seeing the Zero's weaknesses in actual flight was worth 1,000 intelligence reports, he said in a 1975 interview. Hoffman died in 2003 at age 87. John S. Jimmy Thatch, who developed the beam defense position that became known as the Thatch Weave, rose to full admiral. He continued refining fighter tactics throughout the war. When the Japanese resorted to kamikaze attacks in late 1944, Thatch developed the Big Blue Blanket defense system, a layered fighter patrol that provided effective protection against suicide aircraft. After the war, Thatch served as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air and later as Commander-in-Chief of United States Naval Forces Europe. He retired in 1967. When asked about the most important tactical development of the Pacific War, Thatch always mentioned the captured Zero. The Zero had been a mystery before Akutan, he said in a 1979 interview. After Akutan, it was just another airplane with known characteristics and exploitable weaknesses. Thatch died in 1981 at age 76. Tadayoshi Koga's body remained buried on Akutan Island until 1947. The American Graves Registration Service conducted a systematic search of battlefield and crash site burials throughout the Pacific. They found Koga's grave on Akutan and exhumed his remains. His body was reinterred at Adak Island Cemetery further down the Aleutian chain alongside other Japanese war dead recovered from the region. In 1953, the Adak Cemetery was excavated. 236 Japanese bodies were repatriated to Japan. 13 were identified by name. The remaining 223, including Koga, were reinterred as unknown soldiers at Chidorigafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. Koga's family never learned what happened to him. They knew only that he'd been killed in action near the Aleutians. They had no body to bury, no grave to visit. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers determined Koga's final resting place. In 1988, American author Jim Reardon and Japanese businessman Minoru Kawamoto conducted research into Koga's fate. They found the original burial site on Akutan, now empty. They traced records through the Graves Registration Service and determined Koga's body had been among the unidentified remains repatriated in 1953. Reardon later wrote the definitive account of the Akutan Zero, documenting the full story of the aircraft's capture and impact on the war. The Japanese perspective. Japanese historians learned about the Akutan Zero's role decades after the war ended. Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya of the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, a former Imperial Navy pilot and military historian, studied the intelligence failure extensively. He concluded that the acquisition of the Akutan Zero was no less serious a blow to Japan than the defeat at the Battle of Midway. He wrote, "The loss of one intact Zero had cost Japan hundreds of pilots and thousands of lives because American pilots learned to counter every advantage the Zero possessed." The Akutan Zero has been described by military historians as a prize almost beyond value to the United States and probably one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Pacific War. Small pieces of the Akutan Zero still exist in museums. William Leonard, an aviation machinist who witnessed the 1945 collision that destroyed the aircraft, salvaged several gauges and instruments from the wreckage before it was hauled away. He kept them for decades, then donated them to the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C. The gauges are displayed in a case with a small placard explaining their origin. The Alaska Heritage Museum in Anchorage has fragments of aluminum skin and a piece of the control stick. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has additional small pieces, including part of the instrument panel. But most of the Akutan Zero was scrapped in 1945. No complete airframe exists anywhere. Only fragments and photographs remain as physical evidence of the aircraft that changed the Pacific War. There is a photograph in the San Diego Air and Space Museum archives showing Eddie Sanders taxiing the Zero on September 20th, 1942, just before its first test flight. The aircraft looks pristine, fresh paint, American markings clearly visible, the rising sun insignia replaced with white stars on blue circles. Sanders is visible in the cockpit, his face serious and focused. Around the aircraft stand mechanics and guards, watching history about to take flight. Another photograph in the National Archives shows the Zero being lifted out of the bog on Akutan Island in July 1942. Navy personnel stand around the aircraft, which is still caked in mud. The tail points skyward. Cables are rigged under the fuselage. The photograph captures the moment when the most valuable intelligence asset of the Pacific War was finally freed from the Aleutian bog that had held it for 36 days. That is how intelligence victories actually happen in war. Not through elaborate spy networks, though those matter. Not through code breaking, though that changes battles. Sometimes it's just a pilot flying off course in weather too thick to navigate. A machinist mate looking out a window at exactly the right moment. A damaged aircraft attempting an emergency landing on an island nobody cared about. And two enemy pilots who couldn't bring themselves to destroy their friend's aircraft. Koga's wingmen, Endo and Shikata, violated direct orders when they left the Zero intact on Akutan. They knew the consequences. They'd been briefed on the importance of destroying any Zero that fell into enemy hands. They knew an intact Zero in American hands would be catastrophic for Japan's war effort, but they couldn't strafe an aircraft that might contain their living comrade. That moment of compassion, that fundamentally human decision, cost Japan the air superiority it had maintained since December 1941. One intact Zero, one test pilot's methodical analysis, one series of training demonstrations. And suddenly American pilots possessed complete knowledge. They understood the Zero's strengths and could avoid them. They understood the Zero's weaknesses and could exploit them. They knew the exact airspeeds where the Zero became vulnerable. They knew which direction to roll when escaping. They knew how to use negative G forces to disable a pursuing Zero's engine. They transformed from victims into hunters. The Zero never recovered from that intelligence loss. It remained Japan's primary fighter through the end of the war, but only because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to design, test, and mass-produce a replacement. By 1945, the Zero was obsolete. Not because Japanese engineers failed to improve it, but because American pilots knew too much about it. They had studied the instruction manual. They had learned every secret. And they used that knowledge to dominate the skies over the Pacific for the final 3 years of the war. All because one carpenter's son from rural Japan crashed in a fog-bound valley on a remote Aleutian island, and his friends couldn't pull the trigger.